timeless Cornish scene, fishing boats returning to the harbour to unload their catch after a day at sea. It may look like nothing's changed, but what's coming up in the nets tells a different story. My name's Ben Church and this is my climate story. I've loved fishing ever since I was a child, and today I own a small commercial fishing boat called the Jasmine Rose, and I fish for bass, mackerel and pollock with rod and line near my home in southeast Cornwall. I love being out on the water with that sense of freedom and changing conditions, and now my daughters are hooked too. Fishing has never been easy, and it's still one of the most difficult and dangerous jobs out there. But now there's another concern: climate change. And I've been more and more concerned about what effect that's going to have for fishing here in Cornwall.
There's jobs that people have been doing here for 30 or 40 years that have sort of ceased to exist because the fish that they're targeting have just vanished relatively rapidly. In just a few years, things can change quite a lot.
I won't be the last fisherman. I won't be the last fisherman.
Yeah, you never know what we've got on the horizon, really. We didn't expect this.
If there's one thing I know about Cornish fishermen, it's how adaptable we are. We have to be, dealing with fluctuating markets, unpredictable weather and fish quotas. Against all of these, climate change seems like a far-off problem. But I'm not the only one to have started seeing changes.
Every day I go to sea, I take a surface temperature reading. It's given to me on my depth readings. We're seeing in the last 2 years probably a degree difference at least, if not more. 10 years ago you wouldn't see a spider crab this time of year, but what we're seeing now with a slightly warmer water, they're coming in more and more and more. Yes, some people say that it's cold at the moment, just under 10 degrees, 9.8 to 9.9 degrees at the minute. But if you went back, I'd say 10 years, you'd probably still be at like 8 degrees now. Proper winter temperatures.
And we're noticing different types of fish here that we never used to catch. A lot of like Mediterranean octopus, and seems to be more bream and more red mullet, which is sort of Mediterranean species. And the sort of traditional fish like the cod and the haddock and the whiting and that, they seem to be going more and more north. And we've started catching these barrel jellyfish by the ton. To see that many jellyfish, something's changing definitely, you know. We're the first people that would see it because we're actually in it every day. We're on the sea, and you would have to be there to see what's coming up to say there's something wrong here.
Marine biologists have been studying the science behind the changes we're seeing. Steve Simpson is one of them.
Fish are cold-blooded, so they need to live in the places where they're best adapted. So as the water's warm, then that really means that the right place for a species has moved further northwards. Fish on the move due to climate change is never good news. The story for the UK is probably not all bad news in that there are lots of fish species moving into UK waters. But for the fish that are moving further northward, so things like the Atlantic cod, that's now getting really squeezed up to the North Pole. There's nowhere that's going to be colder that fish species can go to. If we look down to the tropics, the fish species are now experiencing waters that are really too warm for them. So we really worry about tropical fish and the many of the world's poorest nations that depend on the fish for their protein in the diet. Temperature obviously does affect fish directly, but it also affects them indirectly. For fish that depend, particularly in the very first few days or weeks of their life, on there being an abundance of prey in the water, they swim around feeding on plankton. That's had really profound effects. We've seen evidence now of plankton distribution shifting by over 1,000 kilometres further north.
These big changes have brought one of the ocean's top predators into Cornish waters. Sometimes called the Ferrari of the ocean, the bluefin tuna can swim at up to 80 miles per hour. The first time I saw one a few years back, it blew my mind. But now we're seeing them more and more often.
There's something definitely happening. There must be to have fish like that up here. Of course, we're not allowed to catch them because there's no record of us ever catching them. A fish is worth like £4,000, so you wouldn't have to catch many fish to give you a wage kind of thing for a year, you know?
And this could be one of the problems as the species in our waters change. A complicated quota system regulates what we are allowed to catch, and it's based on the records of what was caught here in the past.
It is a big problem. If you base quotas around a track record of what you've caught in the past and something new comes on the ground, where does the quota come from? And the Scots saw it particularly over the last 10 years with hake. Historically, they never caught any hake in Scotland. They're catching a lot of hake now and no quota to retain it. We're very lucky. Down in Cornwall, we catch up to 60% non-quota species, the likes of red mullet, cuttlefish, squid, all non-quota species. So the fishermen can catch as much as they like. And one of the reasons they're non-quota is because we haven't got the science behind actually what does a stock look like. You need to know much more about the different species, and until we've got that science, it's very, very difficult to manage. It's not rocket science, it's fishery science, and fishery science is a little bit more difficult.
Cornwall's waters are already the most diverse in the whole of Europe, with fishermen catching up to 70 different species. But you need different types of gear to catch different types of fish, and that's expensive and risky.
Things are changing daily, let alone yearly, and that's the issue, is it's finding the money to adapt. You can't have every sort of fishing gear. One string of nets, fish for red mullet, you're looking at around about £700. To do it properly, you'd need 3 or 4 sets of that gear. So there's, you know, £2,800 near enough straight away, and they nearly have to be replaced once every 2 years. So that's a constant battle all the time.
Some of the fishermen have invested in different types of nets and so forth to target different fish in anticipation of what's changing and moving away from things that are failing. But it's hard to really anticipate what's going to happen in several years' time.
I often land my catch in Plymouth, and getting there takes me past this tiny hut. It doesn't look like much, but it's actually full of equipment helping scientists to find out what's driving the changes in the sea and what might happen in the future.
There's a few sites in the UK that make observations in the atmosphere and in the ocean, but we're very uniquely placed here to be able to look at both the ocean and the atmosphere at the same time. The current estimates are that the ocean has actually absorbed about 90% of the excess heat that's been generated due to increasing carbon dioxide emissions. When the climate warms, we expect to have a windier planet.
The same way that if you warm a pan of milk, you see eddies starting to form, you see the surface of the milk start to get more violent. We're doing the same with the world's oceans.
Every time fishermen are going to sea, they're already having to make a decision between how much physical risk they're willing to face at sea versus the kind of financial risk of staying ashore and not earning a living. So with increased storminess, whether that's more frequent storms or more severe storms, that's posing a greater physical risk for fishermen going to sea. Even a moderate increase in bad weather could really affect small boats, and that comprises about 80% of the registered fleet in Cornwall actually. Some fishing gear is much more dangerous to operate under certain conditions. So for example, lobster potting, if you're hauling heavy equipment on a boat, that's very difficult to do in rough seas. Similarly, something like ring netting, which is hauling a very large weighted net over one side of a boat, is a really dangerous thing to do in bad weather.
Last winter we had just storm after storm, and a lot of the boats hardly went to sea for 2 or 3 months. If the weather is getting worse, the big boats can still go to sea and the modern boats can still go to sea, but the older boats and the smaller boats tend to be kept in. So you get quite a divided fishing industry where the big players are still very successful because the prices are high because most of the fleet is in, and the majority of the boats are stuck in worrying about their livelihoods. So it does have quite a big impact on some people in the fishing industry. A lot of people, really. Also, the boats are probably more capable than they used to be. So weather that might have stopped a boat 30 or 40 years ago, maybe now the boat is a bit more better designed and can put up with that weather. That doesn't mean it's any more comfortable for the fishermen, though.
More than half of what's caught in Cornwall isn't actually fish at all, but crustaceans and shellfish. Like a lot of Padstow fishermen, Johnny Mert specialises in crab and lobster, and he sells his catch to the town's famous restaurants. In summer, the tourists expect a constant supply, whatever the weather.
When historically it would have been really settled, and you get a really good time right through the summer to certainly get in around the shore, we're a lot more wary now. If we get these big storms brewing in the mid-Atlantic, we get heavy swell, so we've got to get all of our gear out of the shore. And it was never the case, 20 years ago. We do a lot to the restaurants, so it's tough when you can't get out and they're all crying out. So, and then you do get a day at sea, and then they're all getting moody with you because you've landed it in one restaurant and not to them.
Malcolm Baker has been fishing all of his life and is one of the few Cornish fishermen who still knows how to make crab pots the traditional way from willow. These were fine when people just put out a dozen or so pots, but nowadays a fisherman might use hundreds or even thousands of much heavier ones hauled up with a winch.
Yeah, I know a chap down in Casworth. he still makes them. And I think there's someone in Devon as well. This year breaks, obviously, so any crabs, after a while, just chew through that. I'll just use iron ones now. Those there, but with the winch you got now, they just pull most of the pieces, or they pull the inside out. There'll be nothing left of them. Yeah, what they used to do is put 3 bricks in them to kill them down, and then they would get waterlogged, but they would still be off it. They'd be still going after a gale of wind. Whereas these sort of things, they're heavier, obviously.
But our more unpredictable weather means even this heavier, tougher gear is more likely to break loose too. Lost nets and pots are hard to recover and become what's known as ghost gear, which can carry on catching and killing sea animals for decades or even longer.
The wind that we have now, I mean, it is gales and gales, proper storms, isn't they? And I don't think we used to get so many as that. You'd get a gale of wind, but now they're talking about 11s, 10s and 11s, isn't they? Storm force. They never used to have it like that. The trouble is, if these tier pots get lost and they got bait in them, they'll be fishing. They'll be still fishing, and they can't get out. So if it gets cut off or breaks through a storm, people must lose an awful lot. You know, if they're right in tight to shore, they must do. I don't know what the answer is really. Go back to these. Go back to them.
But it's not just stormier weather we need to worry about. It turns out the increasing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is starting to make the sea more acidic too. The worry is that this could start to dissolve the shells of animals like lobsters, which are a big business in Cornwall. Almost 500,000 of them are caught each year, and Carly Daniels helps to breed and release tens of thousands of baby ones to boost the local stocks.
Acidification can actually affect the bioavailability of mineral ions in the water, so the calciums and magnesiums that they need in the shell of the lobster itself. That can affect how quick it takes them to harden and therefore how quickly they can protect themselves, because the shell is what protects them from predators. But also there's disease issues. So rising temperatures might be more beneficial to bacterial shell diseases. It's going to degrade the shell of the animal. It's detrimental to the animal, but also detrimental to the fishery as well, because your product isn't as high quality as it would have been before. They also have a benefit to the ecosystem themselves. So they're what we call keystone species. They eat the sea urchins, the starfish, which then allows the kelp to grow. So they do have a bigger role to play in the marine ecosystem than just supporting human populations around Cornwall. They're supporting the marine environment as well.
Another shelled creature, the native oyster, is caught on the River Fowl in what must be the world's most climate-friendly way of fishing. Laws from the 1800s mean the boats can't use engines to fish, and it's just so impressive to see the oystermen working the traditional vessels using the wind and tide. But even here, the oysters which once grew in huge reefs are in trouble.
100 years ago, 200 boats landed 800 tonnes. Now there's 10 boats landing 10 tonnes. Yeah, that is a massive difference. 85% of the world's population of European flat oyster and 95% of the UK's populations have gone, whether that's overfishing, disease, pollution or invasive species. The native oyster is really seen as the northern hemisphere coral reef. If there was this kind of decimation of the coral reef in the southern hemisphere, there'd be absolute uproar. They filter 50 gallons of water a day, each oyster. They create clean water, so the sunlight reaches the seabed, which helps the marine plant life. Without the clean water, the photosynthesis wouldn't happen, the plant life wouldn't grow, and therefore all the other species wouldn't hide in that plant life. What I'm doing with the hatchery and the aquaculture site is trying to repopulate this fishery before it collapses. It's the habitat and the planet that are going to benefit. There's some big problems in the world that we can hopefully start to tackle. We can't change the whole thing, but we can start to ease the pressure. Native oysters are notoriously hard to successfully hatch. You have to have the right temperatures, the right salinities, the right pH level, acidity. But we're going to try and do 4 trials this year. Eventually we can create millions of larvae. Maybe in 10 years' time we might see a big difference, but it is going to be 3 to 5 years before we're going to have anything that we might create this year making a big effect on the bigger picture.
Rebuilding the oyster beds could help to fight climate change, because oysters take in carbon dioxide, to help build their calcium carbonate shells. Chris wants polluting companies to support the oyster recovery as a way of offsetting their greenhouse gas emissions, and he's already got a local concrete company interested.
Their industry is quite a heavy footprint. Cement is lime that's kiln fired and dried, so it's the process of drying the lime which is the big impact. So he's very keen to kind of see if we can work together on balancing out or trying to reduce his footprint. It's just mitigating and offsetting that impact, I think. So we can carry on making concrete products, but we need to put more into natural oyster fisheries in order to balance that.
Native oysters live deep underwater, but I've been noticing another type of oyster much higher up on our shores over the past few years. Pacific oysters, which grow bigger and faster than our native species, were introduced in the 1950s for oyster farms. They weren't supposed to be able to reproduce because Cornwall's waters were too cold, but that's all changed now.
That is amazing. 53 oysters just in one quadrat, and that's probably the highest density that you see anywhere in Cornwall. These reefs just weren't here a few years ago. All around Cornwall we've been finding areas where there are previously no oysters and now got large populations.
But all oysters do a good job of filtering the water and locking carbon away in their shells. So does it really matter whether they're native oysters or invasive Pacific ones?
Mudflats are really important features of our estuaries. They are a carbon storage area, which is very helpful, but also they're rich in life. So if you were to actually dig out a cubic metre of the mud, you'd find huge numbers of little clams and little worms and creatures in there. And if you actually were to add up all the calorific value of all those, it's roughly the equivalent of 30 Mars bars. So it's highly productive. It's really important to wading birds, to fish that will feed on worms. You know, you look at them and you think, oh, there's a load of mud there, what good is that? But actually, it's providing us an ecosystem service, and what we don't want to see is that being lost by being smothered by this non-native species. They're very sharp, and there's been lots of people who've been cut by these. In an area like this, we rely on tourism. If we're losing sandy beaches, that's potentially going to have an impact as well.
But there are uses for these aliens.
Each oyster has got protein inside and a shell made of calcium carbonate, and both protein and calcium are commodities that have a value. You can actually make an alternative to cement by heat treating the crushed shells. The protein can be removed and processed potentially, could be dried, could be turned into protein powder, and there's an international demand for that. At this current rate of growth, we're going to have a supply of Pacific oysters for a very long time, so we really need to try and get on top of it.
One man has already started. Ewan Abram Moore is a landscape gardener and is grinding the shells up into something he believes could massively benefit Cornwall's acidic soils.
It's so satisfying when you hear it going there. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It'll crush granite quite easily. These Pacific oysters are great because they're big and heavy. You look at the sizes, they're only about 4 or 5 years old. You know, I've learnt so much. I've learned a bit more about soil bacteria, soil structure, how important calcium is to plants, how good pH in soil can allow plants to access nutrients that they wouldn't normally be able to. You'd need to give them artificially. All my fruit bushes have the shelly grit sprinkled around them. Vegetable beds, when you're preparing vegetable beds, lightly sprinkled every time you plant the bed makes a good vegetable. Ditto the flowers. So after they've been crushed, I grade them because I do use some of this for chicken grit. It's quite a coarse mix, it's a 15 mil to dust. Love your soil. It's a fabulous resource, doesn't need any more chemicals than crushed shell.
One of the things I love about catching my own fish for food from the sea is compared to farming for meat on the land, it's really low impact. If you're fishing, you don't harm the soil, you're not cutting down trees, you're not using fertilisers, pesticides or irrigation. But I've started to wonder if the fishing industry has too much of a carbon footprint itself. I don't burn a lot of fuel in my boat, but a big trawler can get through 2,000 litres of diesel a day. That's like filling up an average car 40 times.
A mobile gear boat that's towing a trawl along the seabed will use in a day what a static gear boat, so a lobster pot boat or a gill net boat, uses in a week. But, you know, they're the ones that catch in the volumes of fish. So if you equate it to per kilos, it's not as impactful as you might think. but they've got a vested interest in reducing fuel consumption because it's their biggest overhead. We can see the price of fuel going only one way, and that's upwards. So we do quite a lot of work with guys to try and reduce the drag. So, by using compacted twine. So if you remove net from the trawl itself, you can make it easier to tow through the water, hence you'll use less fuel.
The government wants all new commercial boats to be zero carbon capable by 2025. I can't really imagine Cornwall's fishing fleet powered by anything except diesel. Is it even possible?
Norway have got their first fully electric commercial vessel, but we've got a lot of work to do. It is difficult because to change an engine in a boat is a lot more difficult than actually changing an engine in a car. The larger the boat, the higher carbon footprint that it's got. So it will be those that would be the ones that you want to address first, but there's no charging points 100 miles off. You'd have to have massive storage capacity to keep a vessel going for 7 to 10 days. So it's the offshore guys that will really struggle until technology catches up. And I'm sure it will do. What that will look like in 20 years' time, God only knows, but it'd be interesting to find out.
I think becoming carbon neutral for a fishing boat would be a real advantage. It would be good for the environment and it would be good for marketing as well. But if I replace my engine with what I've got, I could do it for £20,000. If I want to go full electric, it would be £85,000. And I'd be restricted to about a 6-hour day at sea just because of the battery banks that are required and the extra weight, so you've got to push that extra weight around, and so I don't think that full electric is quite there for the fishing industry at the moment, but hopefully, not long into the future we'll get there.
Hydrogen is an interesting thing. Hybrid vessels, the ones that have got hydrogen units fitted to boats, I think that is something that could possibly come on within the next 5 years. Trying new technology alongside your rugged diesel engine I think is the way forward. You can go a lot of way to reducing emissions of diesel engines by adding technology to it, and hydrogen generation is one of those, I think.
It's not just how fishermen get around that has a carbon footprint though. Like pretty much everything else these days, Cornwall's fishery is part of a complicated global supply chain.
What I find really bizarre in this modern world is my crab pots are made in China, put on a container ship, sailed through the Suez Canal, brought here, and most of the crab pots used in Cornwall are probably in the same position. Then a Cornish fisherman puts them out to sea, catches some crab, and it's brought in, put on a lorry, driven to Heathrow, put in the cargo hold of a passenger plane and flown back to China. Quite a lot of seafood, like langoustines and smoked salmon and crab, all sorts of stuff is flown around the world in passenger planes, in the cargo holds, but in this world of global warming, is that really sensible to be doing this?
And how our fish is actually caught can have a big environmental impact too. A recent study has suggested that by kicking up the seafloor sediment, which stores more carbon than anywhere else on Earth, bottom trawling could possibly contribute more to climate change than air travel.
It probably is a moment that we can just step back and think, hang on a minute, why are we catching fish in certain ways? Why are we sieving fish from the sea when there might be other ways that we can do that? Pots, hook and line might be better methods to be fishing than simply just trawling over the same ground time after time.
It's a really complicated picture. So if you love eating fish as much as I do, what can you actually do to help reduce the carbon footprint?
Our grandparents' generation would eat cod and chips because the cod were what the boats locally were bringing into port. That now is pretty much exclusively caught further north, Iceland, Norway, Russia. Those fish have moved, but our diet has stayed in one place. We still think that the great British fish dish is fish and chips, when actually what we're catching, what we're bringing into port now is this wonderful diversity of warmer water species that at the moment we're not eating.
We import 90% of the fish that we eat here in the UK and export 90% of the fish that we catch, which is pretty sad. The fish that we've got here is brilliant. What we need to be doing is buying fish caught in the UK, being adventurous and trying different recipes, buying it from local fishmongers and making the most of this wonderful resource we've got.
Now, changing the public diet is not an easy thing to do. We tend to be set in our ways. If we think about the mass-produced food, things like fish fingers, if we can encourage kids at schools to be eating fish that perhaps we historically haven't been eating as much, then generationally we're prepping our own nation to be eating locally into the future. When we look at the fish species that are on the increase, we realise that many of these could actually tolerate much higher levels of harvest. So they tend to be smaller bodied, species. They tend to grow faster, they tend to reproduce younger. They lend themselves to a more sustainable harvest than possibly some of the big cold water species we used to fish for. But we could actually be producing more sustainably than we might have been able to do in the past.
It's a really mixed picture with climate change and the future of fishing in Cornwall. Yes, there will be impacts and changes, but now I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. The key is for us to fish in ways that will not make climate change worse. If we could eat what we catch right here instead of flying fish around the world, we can make Cornish fishing so much more sustainable. We are going to need really good science and management to make sure the new species arriving in our waters aren't overfished, and we'll need to restore and protect our marine habitats to help support them too. Fishing might be one of the most traditional activities in Cornwall, but it's going to have to adapt to the changing times and reduce its footprint, and that goes for all of us. That way, there could still be enough fish in our Cornish seas for our kids to enjoy.
My best friend's dad says I belong in class. Skipping school's not normal. Lying on cold ground is not what I had planned. It's hardly school formal. The children of the revolution, we never knew normal. We were only just waiting for the bomb, 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 for the bomb. We never knew normal, only just waiting. What's that he said? Got my whole life ahead. Yeah, I'm feeling that. Where's the will to be kind? We're leaving men behind. Is this who we are? The children of the revolution. We never knew normal. We were only just waiting for the bomb, 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 for the bomb, bomb, bomb. We never knew normal, only just waiting.